Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. We're covering the Space Security Conference, and we have two folks with us from the Secure World Foundation. We've got Victoria Samson, who is the Chief of Washington Operations for the Foundation, and Brian Weeden, who is the Program Director. Guys, thanks for joining us. Victoria, I want to start with you. What's your guys' mission, and how are you guys involved in the space debate and discussion writ large?
Sure. The Secure World Foundation is a private operating foundation that focuses on the sustainable use of outer space. So we try and promote best practices, norms of behavior, responsible space options so that all can continue to benefit from space over the long term. And that requires working with government, industry, academia, companies in order to work to promote these best behaviors.
And you guys were at the very, very top of the conference. Obviously, Admiral Richard is the one who started it, who was the deputy commander of STRATCOM. But both of you guys spoke on it. Brian, I want to go with you because you're somebody who's written extensively on challenges, threats, the environment as it stands right now. Obviously, space is becoming something more contested. The United States sort of had an overmatch capability, but obviously China's been investing very heavily. Russia obviously has been investing heavily as well as we celebrate the 70th anniversary of getting around to Sputnik. Tell us a little bit about what the space operating environment is today and what each of those actors, whether they're China, whether they're Russia, whether they're India and others, and the United States, what's that environment that we're in right now, and why is it important to have a sort of a clearer space policy?
So there's a lot of change going on in the space world. We're seeing space is becoming more globalized in that it went from being the domain of a couple of superpowers to one where more than 60 countries now have their own satellites or developing space capabilities. And countries are looking to do a lot more in space. They're developing not only human space flight, but also space to support imaging on Earth and weather and science and even commercial activities as well. And that's the second area is commercial is becoming what used to be kind of a minor player to probably the dominant force in space. So those two big trends, globalization, commercialization of space, and then there's a third one, which is increasing use of space for national security and military purposes. And that creates its own challenges in that you might see a conflict on Earth that extends into space or space capabilities that are being targeted or used to support a conflict on Earth. And so that introduces challenges that we've seen in other domains, air, land, sea, about how military operations are conducted that we're now have to worry about in the space domain.
When it comes specifically to, though, what some of these nations are doing, right? Space situational awareness was something that became a priority over the past decade or so. The United States became increasingly concerned with intersecting satellite orb. I mean, there was a whole bunch of things, whether they were Russian or Chinese spacecraft, that were seen as threatening. And so we dramatically increased our space situational awareness capabilities. Obviously, we had China demonstrate a kinetic shoot down. We did our own shoot down as a counter demonstration. But the difference in this domain is, at sea, you can sink a ship and it goes to the bottom of the ocean and it may create some pollution, but basically that goes away. Whereas if you blow up a satellite in orbit, it becomes something that is of lasting danger. Talk to us a little bit about what some of these nations are doing, particularly nations the United States might consider potential adversaries that are particularly threatening, because from a U.S. perspective, the United States would say, look, we are actually pretty constructive, benign players in this space, while others are sort of pushing boundaries maybe that is taking us potentially in a more dangerous space.
Well, some of it is actually returned to the way things used to be. During the Cold War, both the U.S. and Soviet Union had active anti-satellite programs that were doing testing and development of capabilities. That sort of went away with the end of the Cold War, but there is some evidence that Russia has resurrected some of those programs and has kind of pulled them out of mothballs. And it's not that they're going out and blowing up satellites, but they're kind of resurrecting the ability to do so. At the same time, we're seeing some new things emerging. There's a capability called rendezvous and proximity operations, basically getting close to their space object. Now that has some, good uses. You could use it to service satellites, refuel them, remove space debris, but it could also be used for hostile intent. It could also be used to collect intelligence of other satellites. And we're seeing those sorts of capabilities being developed by Russia, China, the United States, and several others. And so that introduces a level of uncertainty, right? Is this rendezvous and proximity operation, is this thing getting close to me? Is it just passing by? Or does it really intend to do me harm? And then do I need to take some action? And that's something that, for what space situation awareness is really needed, right? It's not just tracking that object It's trying to determine its intent and what capabilities it might have.
Victoria, let me go to you. What are some of the policy recommendations that you guys, or the major issues you guys want to see the new administration address?
Well, talk about describing intent. I think if this administration moves ahead with a national space policy sooner rather than later, that's a good way to demonstrate its priorities and interests for its space capabilities overall. As well, the United States needs to figure out what it's going to do about China. That's always a question in every domain, not just space, but it's, I think, particularly tricky because China is one of the major space actors, yet the United States legally cannot do anything between the White House and NASA and China on a bilateral basis. So it's confusing.
Let me take you to more globally. There are those who have been critical, for example, of U.S. strategic arms limitation discussions, for example, with Russia saying it's too limiting, right? That China's not included in it, neither are other actors. And we did have an international test ban treaty that had many, many more nations and various other nuclear-related agreements where there are only a handful of exceptions to those norms. When you're looking at it in space, from your guys' perspective, does there need to be a strategic space use treaty ultimately, or is that something that the advocates of which are just being Pollyanna about thinking that something like that could be done?
I mean, in my opinion, I think the times of treaties have really kind of moved on, particularly when it comes to space, because so much of the space capabilities are dual use. It can either be for civil or it can be for security. It can be for offensive. It can be for defensive purposes. And a treaty inherently tries to ban what you don't want to have happen. It tries to ban a technology. And really what you're looking at is behavior. And so I think it'd be more useful to look at, okay, how can we describe norms of behavior? How can we describe responsible space actions on orbit? And I think that sort of thing would help our national security apparatus much more than any kind of treaty that we're going to be arguing over for decades to come.
I want to make a quick correction. Sputnik this is the 60th anniversary of the launch of the world's first artificial Earth satellite. But let me go to you, Brian. You spend a lot of time looking at space trends. You've been looking at it, obviously the accumulated history of it, but also have a great sense on what are the technologies that are to come. Obviously, the pace of technological development has been changing. The space business itself is fundamentally changing. What are some of the capabilities and threats that are going to be most concerning, say, 5 to 10 years from now? And what's the best way to deal with them?
Well, in some ways, it's more of the same in that some of the most dangerous, concerning capabilities are similar to what was done in the 1960s and 70s, just a little bit better. So there's some techniques for anti-satellites that have gotten refined but are not fundamentally different. What I see as kind of the new aspect to it is the proliferation of those capabilities. It might go from 1 or 2 superpowers that have these capabilities to maybe more than a dozen states that could potentially have some sort of capability. That is a challenge. The other challenge is the growing uncertainty, and that's sort of one that Victoria talked about with space situational awareness. If a lot of these capabilities are dual use, and we don't have great information about what's going on in orbit, that can create situations where there might be misperceptions about what's going on, and that could lead to people making decisions that could spark or escalate conflict. And that's a real challenge.
Guys, thanks very much. Really appreciate it. Victoria, thank you. Brian, thank you.
Our pleasure.
Yep, thank you for having us.